I wanted to take a few minutes to respond to Rabbi Asher Mesa's video that is entitled Disproving Christianity, and I want to ask the question, did he disprove Christianity? Let's look at some of his objections. Number one, he deals with the genealogical problems of Jesus. Now let's first note that Matthew and Luke are giving simply two different genealogies. To start with Matthew is tracing it through Jesus' adoptive father, Joseph. Now, there's a problem because he includes the cursed Jehoniah. Now, there's two very plausible solutions to this. Number one, God reversed the curses on Jehoniah. We find evidence for this in 1 Chronicles 3:17, that he had children. 2 Kings 25:27, that Jehoniah was liberated and did succeed in his day. And in Zechariah 4:7, that Zerubbabel, his grandson, was governor of the Babylonian exiles that returned. Also in Haggai 2, we see evidence as well. The other solution is also plausible. It's simply that Matthew was intentionally presenting this problem and then emphasized that Jesus dodged the curse because he was born miraculously. He was born of a virgin. He was a son of God. And then in Luke's genealogy, we see Luke emphasizing in the first chapter of his gospel on Miriam, Jesus' mother. And in the 32nd verse, he records that the messenger of God visits Miriam and tells her that the child that she would give birth to would sit on the throne of his father David. Now, staying consistent with that focus in chapter 3, we see that the Greek article is absent in reference to Joseph. Most good translations in English translate this as was supposed of Joseph. And then when it picks up with Miriam's father Heli, the article remains. And next is it problematic, according to the Hebrew Bible, to trace one's genealogy through their mother? Well, I would say that it's not normal, but on the other hand, it is perfectly acceptable. I'll give you several instances. In Deuteronomy 25, Numbers 27, Numbers 36, we find through levirate marriages that the inheritance could flow through a woman. Also in 1 Chronicles 2:13, we see that genealogy is passed through the mother with the sons of Zeruiah. Zeruiah was a woman, and her sons are constantly being recognized as genealogically from their mother, not their father. Another example would be 1 Chronicles 2:34 with the case of Sheshan. Another example would be Ezra 2 with Barzillai. Now, the criteria to be the Messiah, son of David, was that you were the son of David. Now, Rabbi Asher objects that the Messianic line had to go through David's son Solomon. Does the Hebrew Bible require this? Absolutely not. There's not one reference, an unconditional promise to the throne of Solomon. For example, in 1 Kings 9, 4-9, it's very important to get this. Solomon's right to the throne was conditional. Now, David's was unconditional. 2 Samuel 7, and in Psalm 89, we see reference unconditionally to the throne of David, but never to the throne of Solomon. Anyone who knows the Hebrew Bible well knows that Solomon utterly failed to meet that condition. Therefore, the Messiah did not have to come through David's son Solomon. Bottom line, Jesus was the son of David, and also it would be expected for the Messiah to have a unique genealogy, for his birth to be somewhat unique, because according to 2 Samuel 7, he would be David's son, and according to other passages, such as Psalm 110, he would be greater than David. Now, the non-Christian perspective that looks for a modern-day Messiah would be much more difficult than any of the discrepancies I just worked through, because the temple was destroyed in 70 AD with the scrolls. It would be nearly impossible to prove in our modern time that someone was the son of David and not the son of Jehoniah. Next is the issue of the necessity of blood sacrifice. Rabbi Meza quotes many passages to cite that there are many other ways for atonement other than blood sacrifice. Is this true? Well, let's look at one passage in Leviticus 5. It teaches that if a person is extremely poor, they can't afford pigeons and doves, they can bring flour to the priest. Here's the point, though. The priest would then take the flour and put it on the altar where blood sacrifice was practiced in the temple. So the flour only had efficacy as it was tied to the blood sacrifice in the temple. If one just reads Leviticus 1 through 17, we see overwhelmingly that the principle instituted in the Torah is that God gave the blood to make atonement for our souls. The Day of Atonement, Leviticus 16, we see that overwhelmingly. Now, when we get to the writings like David and the prophets, where they seem to make statements that contradict that, well, we can know that they are not contradicting that principle for a couple of reasons. Number one, the basis of David's theology and that of the prophets like Hosea and Jeremiah and Micah was the Pentateuch. And in it, we see the principle that the basis for atonement by which we can be forgiven of our sins is the blood. Any other means was only effectuous as it was tied to that. So, whatever the prophets and David mean, we cannot interpret them in contradiction with the Pentateuch. Number two, the original audience in no way believed that they were nullifying the need for blood sacrifice. For example, the ancient Israelites that risked their lives to return from Babylon, they did so because they knew that they needed the temple to be rebuilt so that they could offer blood sacrifice to have atonement for their sins. Another reason is the prophets also affirm the need for blood sacrifice. We see this in Jeremiah, places in Ezekiel. Also, David himself is the one who offers scores and scores of blood sacrifice. So does his son Solomon. So we can know that they were not contradicting the principle already laid down in the Pentateuch. The other issue with that is, does the Hebrew Bible have any evidence that God accepts human sacrifice as atonement? Well, Rabbi Meza said that no, but I'm going to give you several passages that indicate the opposite. For example, Numbers 8 with the Levites. Numbers 25, we have two instances in that chapter. Numbers 35 with the high priest. 2 Samuel 21 with the death of Saul's sons. Isaiah 52:53 with the righteous servant within Israel dying, bearing the sins of his people. Next is the Trinity. What was the basis for the doctrine of the Trinity as taught by the New Testament writers? Well, we can't just assume because there's similarities of a doctrine or of a concept in other religions that the particular religion borrowed and depended on that one. If that were true, you would have to apply that to the revelation that Moses gave. Did Moses borrow from the other monotheistic concepts of the religions around him? Did Moses borrow from the blood sacrificial practices of the nations around him? Well, no, we don't believe that. And neither with the New Testament writers with their doctrines, like the Trinity. We see that the basis for what they believed was rooted in the Hebrew Bible. Namely, in the very first chapter of Genesis, we see the complex unity of God. In verse 1, the first few verses, we see God creating the heavens and the earth, and then distinctly His Spirit hovering over the waters. We see in the 26th verse of the first chapter, God referring to Himself in the plural. In chapter 11, again referring to Himself in the plural. Chapters 18 and 19, we see God both filling the heavens, yet walking in human form on earth, eating with Abraham. And then in chapter 19, we see Yahweh on earth, calling down fire from Yahweh in heaven. Now, from the non-Christian perspective, you can't account for that data. From the Christian perspective, it's perfectly acceptable. We see in Isaiah 63 the personification of the Spirit of God, how He's grieved. So the New Testament writers were getting all of their doctrines, like the Trinity, from the Hebrew Bible itself. Next is the Torah has 613 commandments. Not one of them requires one to believe in the Messiah and has consequences if they don't. Well, so I would first respond by pointing out that the Torah itself doesn't limit one to believe only what's in the Torah. Rather, it teaches us to listen to the revelation that God would give after the 5 books of Moses, namely that of Joshua and that of the prophets, ultimately culminating in Jesus, and saying that if we reject that God's requiring it, would require it of us. So the issue with this is that in the Torah itself we see that faith is necessary. In the one true God, we see Abraham receiving righteousness by faith in Genesis 15:6. We see in Deuteronomy 1:32 the people of God being rebuked for not believing in him. We see in Numbers 14:11 the people of God again being rebuked for not believing in him. In Exodus 20, the 3rd verse, we see God commanding his people to have no other gods before him. And so if we follow the teaching of the Pentateuch, we listen to the revelation after it, namely the prophets, we see that God would manifest himself in human form as the Messiah, Jesus, at a certain time in a certain way. And so when one rejects Jesus, who is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob incarnate, they are necessarily rejecting the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, leaving them in violation of Exodus 20, the 3rd verse. To put it frankly, they are worshiping another God before the true God. And let's see, the next one here is the issue with Abraham supposedly choosing God. Well, this isn't what the Pentateuch teaches. If we read Genesis 12 and elsewhere in Genesis, we see that God electively, sovereignly, graciously chooses Abraham. He calls Abraham, and Abraham responds to him. Next is the New Testament writers allegedly teaching that you just have to follow Jesus, but you don't have to keep God's law. This is not what they teach. Jesus himself teaches in Matthew 28 that we are to make disciples of all nations, to teach them to obey everything that Jesus commanded. We see Paul affirming God's law in Romans 3, saying that by this faith we uphold the law, being that of the Hebrew Bible. We see John in 1 John saying explicitly that if anyone says he knows Christ but doesn't keep his commandments, he's a liar and the truth is not in him. So contrary to what Rabbi Meza claimed, the New Testament writers do teach that one must keep God's law. Next is Judaism is the root of Christianity. Well, it depends on how we define Judaism. If we mean by the definition of the Hebrew Bible alone, I would say absolutely. And I would argue that anyone who reads the Hebrew Bible and follows it out is led to the New Testament writings, is led to Jesus, because that is the fulfillment of what the Hebrew Bible anticipates. And on the other hand, if one defines Judaism as the rabbis do in various ways, in various forms, in various sects, I would say no. I would say that historically Rabbinic Judaism developed as a system. It was codified, the Mishnah and the Gemara, after Christianity, the latter part of the 1st century, and on through the next several centuries. And in many places, the early rabbis, the sages, they nullify, they add to, and they contradict the Hebrew Bible itself. I'll give you a few examples. Rabbi Hillel in Mishnah Gittin 9:10 with his Pros Bull, it nullifies the command in Deuteronomy 15. That's a problem. In Mishnah Sota 9:9, we see Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai nullifying on no basis the law in Deuteronomy 21 and Numbers 5. And then we see in the Babylonian Talmud, Bava Metzia 59b, contradicting Exodus 23:2, where we're clearly stated by God to not follow the majority, but the rabbis say the opposite. No, we're to follow the majority, meaning follow the consensus of the rabbis. Clear contradictions. Another problem is that the non-Christian perspective of the Hebrew Bible is left with unfulfilled promises of God. Daniel 2 speaks of during the Roman era an everlasting kingdom was going to be set up. Well, how do you account for that from a non-Christian perspective? That time came and went over 1,600 years ago. Haggai 2 says that the glory of the second temple would be greater than that of the first. How do you account for that apart from the Christian perspective? Malachi 3, the Lord himself would visit the second temple. How do you account for that apart from the Christian perspective? Daniel 9, final atonement would be made in the first century before the second temple was destroyed. How do you account for that apart from the Christian position? Thank you for listening.